Good evening and aloha. I'm U.S. Congressman Ed Case, coming to you live from my district office in downtown Honolulu. First of all, apologies for a little bit of a throat there. I've been talking a lot, and so I've got a little bit of a rough sound to my voice tonight. Hope you can get through that. I've been here in Hawaii for most of August during our usual summer district work period with many events throughout my district and throughout the state. Returning to DC tomorrow, as a matter of fact, for a very busy September. But it is time to check in with you. And one of the things I want to say right up front is that one of the rules of Congress is that during the 60-day period before any election, I'm not allowed to have any mass communications with you. And so that explains the fact that it was back in June that we did our last talk story or mass newsletters, but with the election over and before we have the 60-day blackout period for the general election coming up, it is time for me to check in with you again. Look, we of course continue through a very divisive and polarized and difficult period in our country's history. I think we would all agree that this is a hard time for our country and world. If I take a look back at the last couple of years, I would really mark the current period with particularly difficult and divisive issues in governance, really to March of 2020 when we saw the rise of COVID-19. And in those 2.5 years since, or early 2020, just think about what we have faced. Of course, we faced COVID-19 itself and the incredible disruption and tragedy of COVID-19 throughout our country and world. We had a January 6th attack on our United States Capitol, which I witnessed and was a part of personally, which represented the deepest sort of division and polarization in our country. Russia invaded Ukraine. We saw the rise of crippling inflation that we're still in the middle of. At home, we faced Red Hill and some other major issues, and that's just to name a few of the issues. So these have been a tough couple of years here. But our government is organized and in its good moments works to address the challenges that we collectively face as a collective citizenry. And that's after we take care not only of the crises that we face, such as the ones I just mentioned, but the everyday, every year obligations of government, obligations such as funding our federal government every year, in my case, obligations such as providing law enforcement, obligations such as a social safety net, paying Social Security. These are things that go on, and we have to have a functioning government, but we especially need it during crises, and that's when we need to communicate with each other the most. And I am one of your representatives in our federal government, and I need to hear from you often. And that is why I spend so much time in my office reaching out to you in various ways, whether they are newsletters, these talk stories, which have been, remote for over two and a half years. I miss tremendously the personal talk stories. Hope we can get back to them soon, but these will have to do still for a little bit longer, I believe. And so this is time for me to check in again and to listen, to answer your questions, to take your guidance, to try to absorb your feelings about what's going on, and to share with you the world that I live in on Capitol Hill as we face these issues for our country. Let me just cover a couple of logistical issues before we get into the meat of this. We've got until 7:30 together. We'll have to get off promptly. That's all the time that they've given me. I'm going to address some top issues and then get into your questions as soon as I can. Now, here's how to ask questions. Call 855-274-9528. 855-274-9528. And press star and 3 on your phone, and our staff will take your question. In past talk stories, I've actually had you hang on the phone and try to have a Q&A live, but I've just found that there's so many questions that just takes too much time, and I don't get to the questions as fast. And so we're gonna continue along those lines. We'll take your questions down faithfully, and I'll read them off faithfully too. You can also ask your questions if you're watching on Facebook. You can go to the facebook.com/RebEdCase and ask your questions there. My staff will take them and feed them into us. Or if you're on case.house.gov, /live that will also provide you with a way to ask your questions. If we don't get to your question tonight, I really apologize, but we will definitely try to answer it. You can email me directly at ed.case@mail.house.gov. Or if you just don't want to ask a question, but you want to follow up, that's fine too. Finally, of course, we're in election season. Every 2 years, we have elections in the U.S. House of Representatives, and this year we've got other elections as well. This is an official congressional event. This is sponsored by, paid for by the U.S. Congress to enable members of Congress to consult and listen with and listen to and inform the folks that we represent. It is not a campaign event. It cannot be a campaign event. I can't get into the campaign and election year. There are other ways of doing that, and I ask that you not get directly into the campaign and the election either. Issues are fair game. My record, what I've done, that's all fair game. But when it gets overtly into the campaign, we'll have to decline to go in that direction under the understandable rules of Congress. Okay, I always try to start out by just reminding you of what I think my job is on your behalf in the United States Congress. Again, we have 2 U.S. senators for Hawaii, as with every state, and we have 2 members of the U.S. House of Representatives for Hawaii. Unlike other states, it depends on population. We're one of the smaller ones. We have 2. Don't feel bad. Some states only have 1, but we've got 2. And I represent the 1st Congressional District, which is the district that is urban Honolulu. It starts on the east at Makapu'u, comes all the way through the center of Honolulu and Pearl City, up to Mililani and beyond, just to the border of Wahiawa in central Oahu, and then down through Waipahu and Ewa and Kapolei out to Ko'olina and Kahe Point. That is the current 1st Congressional District. So if you live in that district, I'm your U.S. Congressman. Now the way, and that is about 720,000 people. The other 720,000 people in our beautiful state live and work and play in the 2nd Congressional District, which is the rest of the state. So everything other than what I just described on the leeward side of the mountains, urban Honolulu, and all of the other islands. And your current representative is Kaili'i Kahele, my current partner in Congress. And he, of course, is not continuing in that role. And so come January, when we start the next Congress, you will choose a new person if you're in that district to represent you. It doesn't really matter a whole bunch as a practical matter what district an issue arises in, what district a particular constituency believes they need help. The Hawaii Congressional Delegation has a long history of really understanding that Hawaii cannot just be divided down the middle of some mountain range and call it a day. And I only worry about the first. Whoever's in the second only worries about the second. It just doesn't work that way. And so as a practical matter, I really view my obligations primarily to the first, but also to the entire state. And I'm sure that anybody has ever occupied the second, as I once did, also believes the same way. I like to say that as your U.S. Congressman, I've got 3 parts to my mission. Number 1, as a member of Congress under our Constitution, with my vote and with my actions, I try to contribute to national leadership on issues of our day, issues our country faces and our country faces in our world. That's my job, to set the course for our country and to react to and respond to crises as they occur throughout our country and our world. Second, critical is to make sure that a small state like Hawaii doesn't get lost in Washington, D.C., to make sure that our federal government is taking care of us in Hawaii, our unique needs, being 5,000 miles away, understanding what we need, developing the proper and direct resources and approaches to take care of our needs. That's easier said than done a lot of times, because a lot of times people in Washington, D.C. just don't understand us here in Hawaii. We're pretty unique in a lot of different ways. And sometimes you got to do a little bit of explaining and persuading about why things have to be a certain way when it comes to helping out Hawaii. And then finally, what we call casework in our office, all congressional office, and that's assisting you and yours with your individual concerns. We all encounter our federal government at one time or another in our lives, whether we like to or not. Social Security, Medicare, veterans benefits, immigration, um, TSA, any range of issues. And my job is to make sure that your federal government is listening to you and responding to you on those individual concerns. We do a lot of that work on your behalf. I use every tool at my disposal in terms of fulfilling these three separate parts of my job. Of course, I use my relationships with my colleagues in Washington. This job is not a job that you can get done alone. You've got to know people. You have to be able to relate to them and to have them relate to you. You have to develop connections of trust, of mutual interest, of goals throughout your time in Congress. And the longer you're there, the better those relationships are. I have tried my very best to continue those relationships in many different ways, including people that are not particularly similar to me or to our state, and so I try very hard to do that. I also, of course, use my committees. We're organized by committees in Congress. These are areas that you focus on. I've been very fortunate for the past 4 years to have two outstanding committees. The first, Appropriations, the committee that funds our federal government. So I have my fingers in pretty much everything in our federal government, since whatever it is, it has to be funded, and in one way, shape, or form. And so that's been a tremendous platform, really, not only to guide our country, but to help our Hawaii, especially during COVID, during Red Hill, during some of these other crises that we face here in Hawaii that have really required large amounts of federal resources to get us all through. My other committee, Natural Resources, which I'm particularly passionate about, which addresses the protection of our country's and our world's natural resources, as it sounds like, as well as responsible for our country's indigenous peoples. And so this is a committee that I use very widely to try to advocate for our Native Hawaiians in particular in our federal government, and for the programs that are targeted to their particular needs and goals. I also am a member of various caucuses. These are individual collections of members of Congress that assemble around a particular issue and try to act collectively. Some of them are particular to a country. For example, we have a U.S. Philippines Friendship Caucus, and it sounds like what it is. It focuses all of us in that caucus focus on the great country of the Philippines and our connection with the Philippines, and of course, being the member of Congress out of 435 that represents more Filipino Americans than any other district out of 435 in our entire country. I'm going to want to be sure that I focus on that relationship. We have a similar caucus for Japan, Australia, etc. We also have issue caucuses that we tend to focus our interests in mutually. And then finally, we've got, I'll give you one good example of that. The Congressional Pacific Islands Caucus, which I co-founded about 3 years ago on a bipartisan basis, by the way. Most of these caucuses are bipartisan in one way, shape, or form. I don't care whether somebody who wants to work with me on the relationship with the Philippines has an R or a D or some other letter after their name, as long as that's what they want to do and they want to work in good faith. We formed the U.S. Congressional Pacific Islands Caucus to focus on our own ohana here in the Pacific, on the belief that they weren't getting enough attention really in Congress. Their needs, their goals, their critical importance to not only our Pacific but to our country and to our world. I also have great staff. I've benefited throughout my career in Congress from having great people around me who feel passionate about our country, our state, and about you. I have two offices that they work out of. One is our Washington, D.C. office, where we tend to focus on things that Congress is doing directly. And then back here in Honolulu, as I said, downtown Honolulu, where I've got my staff that really keeps me in touch and is your really primary point of contact with my office. We do all of our individual constituent services here as well. And then finally, I use the tool of communications, as I talked about earlier. I try every single way I can to stay in touch with you, whether it be e-newsletters or letters, or text to your phone, surveys, and of course this talk story. And if you've got any other ideas about how I can stay in touch, let me know. We also conduct full outreach when I'm back, as we have been throughout August. So that's a little bit of the logistics. I just wanted to remind everybody that when you dial that number to ask your question, that number again is 855-274-9528. Once you dial it, and it answers, press *3 to ask a question. Press *3. You can't just dial the number and ask the question. You got to dial *3 and then go for the question. All right, let me talk about a couple of issues, and I'm going to whip this because I see my questions are piling up, and a common post talk story, self-criticism, and within my offices, I always take too much time on this part of it to give you my overview, but I always have a lot to try to tell you about. So apologies, but I'm going to do this really, really fast. And just because I don't cover an issue doesn't mean I don't care about it. It's not important. It's just these are the ones that I hear about the most. And each of these issues could probably take an hour and a half talk story to really walk it through. So I'm just going to hit the high points and move on. The last couple of months before the blackout period is I did do surveys, and I did one survey, which was a phone text survey just last week, once we came out of the primary election blackout. I've had a pretty consistent response from you as to what you view as the top concerns in your life that you want to face. And I want to talk about those top concerns up front, as well as a couple of others that I think we would all agree are really critical. Those surveys, and there have been 3 or 4 of them now, no surprises here, at least for me. Top 5 issues: our economy, crime, gun violence, but not just gun violence, but overall crime, inflation, of course, our environment, especially climate change, understandable given the critical existential threat, really, of climate change. And then finally, just political division, the functioning of our government. Those are the areas that come back from you. And I would add, others that obviously are concerns that we can get into as you want. I'll cover a couple of these, but we obviously have major issues in terms of Ukraine, Red Hill, China, and many, many more. And so I just want to kind of address some of these very, very briefly and then go right to your questions. Let me take our economy first. And by the way, it's impossible really to separate these issues. They don't kind of go on, nice stovepipes. Obviously, the economy is related to inflation. Economy and inflation are related to Ukraine, for example. So I'm just going to try to hit these. Our economy does feel shaky to us all. I completely agree with that. We're all uncertain about where our economy is going. We've seen wild gyrations in our stock market. We've seen, of course, reports of negative growth in our economy over the last couple of quarters. We have an active debate going on about whether we are or are not in some form of a recession. And these are all incredible concerns. I mean, we need a functioning economy to provide for many, many things in our lives, not just jobs, not just for our families, but also for the resources to be able to take care of common needs through government. Of course, our economy was significantly impacted by COVID-19, and we were forced, and I believe rightly, to spend trillions of dollars to stabilize our economy. I think that worked. I think we were able to stabilize our economy. But although we see some positive signs, especially in recent months, we've seen actual income growth across our country. We've seen much lower unemployment. We're back down in Hawaii to about 4%. And we've seen some of the highest levels of exports from our country, which is one sign of a good economy ever. And so, again, if that's all happening, then why do we all feel so uncertain about the economy? And I think there are a couple of reasons. It's number one is simply the fact that we're not out of the woods in terms of some of these very dislocating crises that we face, whether they be Ukraine or um, or COVID. But also, if you have a good economy and your income is growing, but it's getting eaten by inflation, which is higher than that, then of course you're going to believe, and correctly, that the economy is not working for you. And I think that that is definitely what is happening. I think there's a couple of things that we're trying to do at the national level that I think will be very, very positive for economic revitalization throughout our country and for stabilization, really. Number one, the normal appropriations process. I referred to that earlier on in terms of our federal funding every year, which is doesn't just happen in a vacuum. We do try to target it to specific needs throughout our country, both nationally as well as in our states. And that is an area that I particularly focus on. We've also had two huge bills that are now law that are intended to facilitate economic growth. The bipartisan infrastructure package, $1 trillion plus, generational investment in our infrastructure is an economic driver in and of itself. The Inflation Reduction Act that we just passed into law just a few weeks ago is an economic driver in and of itself. And so I think that these are areas that I think will stabilize our economy, but I'd be a fool to say that it's going to automatically be great overnight. This is going to take some time to work our way back out of some of these challenges, and especially to deal with inflation. And I think as we do that, we will start to all have a sense of and a reality that the economy is far more stable than we sense that it is today. Crime and gun violence. We feel that acutely here in Hawaii. It is on the top of our minds. We've had high profile crimes in the last weeks and months. Although we have seen lower levels of violent crime, notwithstanding those specific crimes that we've seen and heard so much about, we have seen also an uptick in property crimes throughout Hawaii, which has always been the case here. We've always had a lower level of violent crime and a higher level of property crime, primarily targeted perhaps many times to our visitors, but obviously not exclusively. We've also all suffered from it ourselves. Look, there are no magic bullets on crime. You have to have solid law enforcement in order to deter crime, and once it happens, to catch crime and to prosecute it. And so this debate that you sometimes hear about, well, let's solve crime by reducing the capacity of law enforcement. That's never made any sense to me. We've got to support our law enforcement organizations fairly. Of course, they have to operate fairly and within the law. Yes, of course, that's true. But we also need to support them in what they need to fight crime on behalf of all of us. In that area, my appropriations committee has really taken the lead with major increases in funding for many of the programs that our law enforcement communities particularly rely upon from funding for the Department of Justice to the Burn JAG grants, which come directly to our local law enforcement communities, very specific kinds of crime, violence against women. These all add up. And as we strengthen law enforcement, I think we also strengthen our crime prevention and crime prosecution abilities. Gun violence is an epidemic. It's a tragedy. It is a national embarrassment for our country. And there is no way around that from my perspective. I believe that people should be able to responsibly own responsible guns and exercise Second Amendment rights. But I don't think that that encompasses, no background checks on a pretty young person to buy assault rifles and high capacity ammunition clips and go out and kill dozens and dozens of people. I mean, I don't believe that that is the right policy for our country. And so I have supported I believe reasonable, gun regulation legislation proposals that have come through Congress, starting with the simple one of just requiring a higher level of background checks to catch people that are in the post-teen period, and even to reach back into juvenile records in some cases to identify very crime-prone people that are coming into adulthood. That's been one of the tragedies that's happened. We passed that particular law with bipartisan support. It's the first responsible gun violence legislation in a generation, a good 20, 25 years. Thought that was a good start. But a lot more remains to be done. Now, here in Hawaii, of course, we have had some of the most responsible gun regulations for decades now. And I hope that doesn't change. That's not a decision for the federal government. That's a decision for you, us, with the folks that we're electing to state and county government. Let's talk briefly about inflation. Inflation has crippled all of us over the last, especially 1 year. Why? A couple of different reasons for inflation. Number one, COVID-19 expenditures and money into the economy to stabilize, to grow the economy, really became available to people as supply chains were tightening up, so that we had a complete imbalance of supply in terms of available money and the willingness of people and the desire of people to spend money after being shot up for a year plus was coming in conflict with supply chains that restricted the availability of goods and services, and that's a recipe for inflation. And to add to that, we had historically low interest rates, which made it very, very easy to borrow a lot of money without real cost, as well as energy prices being crippled because primarily of the Ukraine invasion. When we, I think, necessarily needed to restrict and embargo any imports of oil from Russia. And so it was really a perfect storm. We have seen, again, it's a little bit like the economy. We've seen some stabilization in inflation in just the last few months. We really see now that inflation reached its peak really around March or April. It's been declining since then. And last month, on a measure of that particular month, there was virtually no inflation. So there's some stabilization going on. But that's like saying, let's just accept the rate where it stands today, which is at a very, very high level. We can't accept that. We still need to go after many, many items of inflation wherever we can. We already know that our Federal Reserve, which manages our interest rates, has been increasing those interest rates. That's to tame inflation. It causes its own pain, but it is necessary, I believe. We also have started to see much more freedom in our supply chains. It's becoming a little bit easier to get things in the kind of volume that people want. And that's really tampered some of the prices. Of course, energy and oil, very specific areas that we have just particularly been hit hard on in terms of the world stage. Those have been persistent problems. The bipartisan infrastructure law will help the supply chain. That will come into play over the next months and year. The Inflation Reduction Act goes directly at energy costs, and it also goes directly at some of the real drivers of inflation. For example, prescription drugs, for example, healthcare premiums. These are really long sought after cost controls that translate into lower prices. No, they're not going to happen overnight. But yes, they have been enacted into law, and I believe that they will have that effect. So we're going to have to keep plugging away at each of these items of inflation, and I believe that we will see inflation start to become less of a concern for all of us in the next couple of months and into 2023. The environment, very briefly, I completely agree on the priority that you've given to the environment. That is one of my top priorities as well. The Inflation Reduction Act, despite its name, was number one, first and foremost, the most revolutionary, the most far-reaching, the most widespread attack on climate change by our federal government ever. By the way, the second best was the bipartisan infrastructure plan, which in and of itself was a revolutionary bill to go after climate change. This is a big, big bill. And the bottom line is we are all investing somewhere in the range of $400 billion in trying to attack the challenge of climate change and leading the world from this perspective. And this is a major, major advance for climate change. many of our environmental issues that we face, from rising sea levels to coastal storms that we all know here in Hawaii have had such a consequence to our shorelines, to our highways. That all starts and ends with climate change. Maybe it's not the only factor, but there's no question it is a factor. Probably, I believe, the major factor. So these are critical investments that we're making in the environment. Another area that we are focusing on with the environment is our world's oceans. I actually just came back earlier this afternoon from an important conference in Kona, the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force. This is formed by our government about 24 years ago to coordinate our efforts to save our coral reefs, but also just to save our oceans. And the leaders of our country came to Kona. I joined them and was able to present to them the efforts of Congress in this area. I just give this to you as one example of my activities in the environmental space, and of course that's related to climate change as well. A couple of others, and then I'm going to stop. Political division. I completely agree. Now let's be clear about this. We have differences of opinion in this country. Of course we do. I represent 720,000 people, and no two of them think exactly alike. There are differences, and there are differences among citizens. There are differences among how we organize ourselves as parties, and these differences exist, and they need a way to be resolved. And we set those methodologies and mechanisms up in our Constitution. And I believe that as we honor the intent and purpose of our Constitution, we can resolve these differences. We have. But there's a difference between that and division for the sake of division and dysfunction just for the sake of never agreeing with a different perspective, never trying to appreciate what the other side is trying to achieve, never considering that there's another approach out there. And so, the debate needs to happen. I make decisions every day that are choices between one perspective and another. But I look for opportunities to work with others where I can that I may not agree with on some of these issues. I may very, very strongly disagree with them, but where I can work with them, of course, I'm going to try to work with them. And I think that that's the way forward here. Many of the decisions that we make in Congress actually are fairly nonpartisan. Some of the bills that I have already mentioned were bipartisan bills, the bipartisan infrastructure plan being one. Much of our appropriations work is pretty nonpartisan. We obviously have our partisan differences there, but we work cooperatively. So I look for those opportunities, and I just give you a couple that I think are maybe illustrative of a better way of doing things. I'm a member of the Problem Solvers Caucus, and that's a caucus by rule of an equal number of Republicans and Democrats. We've got about 29 Dems and 29 Republicans now, as I recall. We look for issues that are tough issues where we talk about whether there's a way for us to find a solution. And if we can get to a solution, then we advocate collectively for that solution. Now, we disagree deeply on a lot of issues. That's not the point. We're not trying to agree on everything, but we're trying to look for things that we can agree on and get those done as a more systematic way rather than yelling and screaming at each other. We succeeded in the bipartisan infrastructure plan that came out of the Problem Solvers Caucus primarily. So it is possible to do that. Then I give you one other kind of small one, but these things add up. I participate in something called the Congressional Bipartisan Project. And the idea is really simple, that two members of Congress from separate parties, from separate parts of the country, from separate ideologies, will spend time with the other member in his or her district and then try to understand their world. And I have participated in that. My partner is Representative Chris Stewart. He's a representative from Utah. I went to visit him in Utah and saw his world. I didn't agree with a lot of his thinking. His world was a strange world to me in a lot of ways, but I understood it at least. And we have found since then bills that we can agree on and work on. I'm a co-sponsor with him of a bill that's important to him, in his district having to do with how our federal government manages public lands in the West. Okay, maybe that doesn't have a whole bunch to do with Hawaii, but it has a whole bunch to do with how government works. He's going to come visit me right after the election, and I'm going to educate him on Hawaii and see what I can do to change his mind. Finally, Red Hill, huge issue for all of us. Obviously, over the last 1 year plus, from my perspective, we've been at this since I came back to Congress, acutely since May of last year, when we had the when we had the first leak. Um, Bottom line on Red Hill, we're in a process right now that I definitely support, believe in, and I'm pushing. Um, the military has said they're going to close Red Hill after they defuel it safely. They have not walked that back. I'm not going to let them walk that back. We need to get Red Hill defueled as soon as we can. We know it's going to take more time than we hoped because it has to be safe before it's defueled. Otherwise, we'll be right back in the place that we don't want to be. Um, the next step here is the military owes us all by September 7th its defueling plan. And assuming that defueling plan gets approved by both the Environmental Protection Agency and the State of Hawaii Department of Health, with the participation of the Board of Water Supply here and others, then we're going to try to get that implemented as soon as possible and get it defueled. We have funded over $1 billion out of the appropriations committees, myself on the House side, Senator Schatz on the Senate side, with a lot of partnership from both Representative Kahele and Senator Hirono, who are members of the Armed Services Committees, to do that in FY 2022. That's the money that we're using right now. And we have in the pipeline another $1 billion for FY 2023. That's the fiscal year that starts in just a few months. So that's where Red Hill is right now. There are many, many issues on Red Hill. In addition to that, and especially on Red Hill, if you have any particular questions or issues, please contact me. I've got other things on my list, but I did what I promised I wouldn't do, and that was to go too long. Okay, questions. Again, 855-274-9528. Press *3. I'm going to just work my way right down the questions here. Bert, what do you think are solutions to resolve the divided happening in the country? I tried to address that. Division happens because people stop believing that we can actually work together. Division happens because people stop trying to understand another perspective and look for a common ground. So we've lost the habits of hanging together on stuff and solving big picture items together. And of course, there are many forces in our country that intentionally and purposely drive us apart. And so I think each of us, has a responsibility to try to look past whatever cable TV show you watch, whatever your sources of information are, whatever you do or don't think about a particular member of your government, and try to envision how we can get our cake and eat it too. How we can reach a goal that can maybe not be our perfect solution, but is enough of a solution that's good for our country. So I try to pursue the mechanisms that will achieve that. But at the end of the day, it's a mindset and it's a commitment, and it's a commitment not just by your elected officials, but I think you should require your elected officials to have that commitment, and I think you should make your choices accordingly. Let's see. Elena, what is the progress regarding the banning of assault rifles and the bullets that load them? What is that impact of the new law that people can now register to have guns, concealed or not? Okay, I spoke to that a little bit earlier. We passed out of the U.S. House of Representatives the assault rifles legislation that would severely restrict, not ban altogether, but severely restrict ownership of very, very far more dangerous guns than just your average handgun, average, rifle, which, again, I have no problem at all with people owning and exercising their rights of responsible ownership. But I don't think that there is a societal reason for to allow people to own on an unrestricted basis very, very dangerous weapons that can be used for multiple murders in a very, very short period of time, as we have seen repeatedly. And so that is the bill that you're referring to that passed out of the United States House of Representatives. And unfortunately, there are not the votes as we sit here today in the United States Senate to pass that bill, as I think we should. That bill has passed before. It lapsed and it was never reinstated. And I think that's a tragedy. And I think that that's the reason that we have seen, not the reason, because obviously it matters who the people are that own the guns. I'm kind of tired of this constant, back and forth. Well, it's not the people, it's the guns. And the other side goes, it's not the guns, it's the people. You know what? It's both. It's both. We've got to take it on both sides of that equation. And we need to get that done, or we're going to see many, many more deaths. In terms of concealed or not, excuse me, there was a recent decision out of the United States Supreme Court in a New York case that where some citizens challenged, as is their right, a very restrictive New York law against concealed weapons. And basically, the Supreme Court, in so many words, said the New York law was too restrictive. It interfered, too much with the ability of people to responsibly own guns and to protect themselves. I'm sure there are lawyers out there and others that are going to question my subjective interpretation. So apologies, but that's what I think it said. And as a result, because that's the United States Supreme Court interpreting U.S. law, those states like Hawaii that have very strong concealed weapons state laws have had to re-look at their own state laws because we don't want it to get kicked out by the U.S. Supreme Court like it happened with New York. So that process is going on in our state legislature right now and in the counties. In fact, we've seen some counties take a little bit of a different view than other counties in terms of how they're going to respond to it. But that's the status of that. But the bottom line is that what we really need is federal federal legislation that will set a standard throughout the country. And if any state wants to, best that standard, then that's up to them. Let's see, Mary, I want to know about Red Hill, our water sourcing, and what you're doing to ensure that the Navy consults with people outside its narrow range. Mary, I tried to give a very, very quick summary of Red Hill. Essentially, what's happening right now is we're trying to close it. We're trying to defuel it before we close it, and we as collectively, all of the related federal, state, and county agencies, along with consultation with the community, to do so in a safe way. Excuse me. I've been in constant contact with the Navy for the better part of a year and a half now, and more, even before May of last year when the leak occurred, to force them to consult with our communities out there. Now, there are many very, very good community organizations that have participated in the proceedings and have really, I think, done a really good job of representing the community. And of course, the Navy itself has held public meetings repeatedly on this. I have also held Red Hill specific public meetings. I did one with Congressman Kahele a couple of months back. And my commitment is to include the public in this. The next step is the defueling plan. There should be, and I believe will be, opportunity for the public to comment on that defueling plan. Let's see, inbound call. Let's see, Mickey. Why is Biden spending trillions of money adding to our national debt? How can this condition be sustainable? Cost of living, Trump left 1.5%, now 9% with Biden. I think that's a reference to the inflation rate. Well, I've tried to get to the reasons why inflation has been so incredibly high. Again, COVID-19 spending to stabilize our economy and communities. That was obviously something that that occurred in part on President Trump's watch, in which he supported, but did put a lot of money out there in the community. Certainly, the supply chain constraints really didn't show up until after the Trump presidency and into the Biden presidency from COVID. And then obviously Ukraine didn't happen in the prior presidency. So, I don't want to get into whose fault it was, or 1.5 or 9%. I think it's pretty explainable why it happened, regrettably, and I think it was a cascade of events, as I've already said, kind of a perfect storm that I don't think any president probably could have avoided under the circumstances, or country. I don't want to go there on that. I want to try to answer the substance of your question, which is why are we contributing to the national debt? Well, first of all, I completely agree with you that we should worry about our national debt. That's been one of my major concerns in Congress for the better part of 20 years, dating back to when I first went to Congress in 2003, when our national debt was, as I recall, $9 trillion. Now we're over $30 trillion. We have one of the highest debt to GDP ratios of any country in the world. That's a dangerous place to be. So we cannot afford to ramp up our national debt any further, unless we have a true emergency like COVID, where we needed to do it. The alternative to doing that was far worse than the medicine we had to take, which included increasing our national debt and borrowing that money. I'm a member of a number of organizations and coalitions that focus on our national debt. The Blue Dog Coalition is one of them. And I fought very hard for that bipartisan infrastructure bill to be a responsible, fiscally responsible bill, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act, which just passed because its predecessor, I didn't think was fiscally responsible. Excuse me. Let me clear one thing up straight up here. I've read a bunch of stuff online and gotten a lot of comments in my office along the lines of the Inflation Reduction Act, the bill we just passed, is going to contribute to the national debt. It does not contribute to the national. This is one of the first major pieces of legislation in decades that has actually been fiscally responsible. It does not increase the deficit. It doesn't increase debt. It spends money, but it also finances the spending of that money through initiatives that I believe are appropriate. I believe it's appropriate that our corporations not pay zero in some cases, and that we have an understanding that they're going to pay at least a certain amount. And so this particular bill, although it's a very large bill from a finances perspective, was scored, as we say in Washington. Scored means what is the net effect on our fiscal situation? Is it positive or negative? It was scored positive by $300 billion over 10 years, and so that's a responsible piece of legislation. Now that doesn't mean I wish we could do all of our bills that way. We're still tempted to add to our debt, and I agree with you. That's a major concern. Brian, when are we going to get serious about the potential of getting by a hurricane in Hawaii? Where are the shelters for hurricane in Hawaii? Well, I don't think any of us can deny the possibility of a hurricane in Hawaii. I mean, we've seen it in spades in recent decades. We've obviously seen other weather events that have caused major emergencies in Hawaii, from flooding to coastal surge, just in the last couple of months. And I think that this is really a partnership among federal, state, and county governments and communities to properly prepare for these natural disasters. I don't know whether any community is ever fully prepared for a major natural disaster, but I believe that we are trying very hard to be quite prepared. I work regularly with the Federal Emergency Management Authority, or agency rather, FEMA, who works with their counterparts in the state of Hawaii, HIEMA, as well as the county civil defense and law enforcement and other agencies. We fund their activities to get ready. I don't know enough as I sit here about the distribution of actual shelters throughout our state and whether they are sufficient or what the assumptions are behind those. That's really a detail that's handled more by the state and county governments, but certainly that is definitely an issue that I take from your question and we'll follow up with my state and county government partners and others. Beverly, are there any plans to help out tenants of commercial landlords that received PPA loans that are now being displaced? Landlords keep kicking them out after not paying rent during COVID. All right. There were, I think you're referring to PPP loans, if I'm not mistaken. These were some of the most major areas of assistance that we provided, especially to our small businesses during COVID, which were, of course, devastated by COVID, especially here in Hawaii, because so many of our small businesses were dependent directly or indirectly on tourism. And those loans really, I forget what the figure was, but it was in the tens of thousands of, we had one of the highest utilizations in the entire country of PPP loans. I just met week before last with the U.S. Small Business Administrator here in Hawaii, and we discussed with her how much it meant to our community, to our economy, that those loans were available and were distributed during COVID-19. But your question is whether there's going to be any more of them, and I have to say no. We don't have any current plans to especially where COVID is right now, which is, knock on wood, receding, especially in the last few weeks here in Hawaii as well as the rest of the country. We should not need that level of support anymore for individuals or businesses as a result of COVID-19. Some of that COVID-19 assistance is still available. There is still money at the state and county government level that they are deciding what to do with. But we're not going to pass, I don't believe, anymore at the federal government. Now, there is a process still of a required mediation, as I recall. So a landlord cannot simply kick you out for not paying your rent. There has to be a process followed that gives you a chance to discuss reasonably with the landlord before the landlord tries to take you to court on that. So if you haven't thought about that process, please try to do that. And if you have any questions, call my office or email my office. By the way, my email is ed.case@mail.house.gov, ed.case@mail.house.gov. Bert, what do you think are the solutions to resolve the dividedness happening in the country? I'm going to pass that one, Bert, because I answered it already, and I got a bunch of others. Let's see. Jack, question about retroactive combat pay for Korea veterans. Also wanted to talk about the issues with refuse collections. I'm not sure of your question about retroactive combat pay for Korea veterans. If you can please email my office at ed.case@mail.house.gov, ed.case@mail.house.gov. We'll try to answer your question. I just don't know as I sit here right now. It could be that you are talking about our recent PACT Act, which is related to toxic exposure by our military in combat or in service, not just in combat, which really was a revolutionary bill that significantly expanded the level of veterans' health benefits for veterans that desperately did need help and yet didn't qualify. We're talking about the burn pits in Iraq. We're talking about Agent Orange that wasn't covered by earlier legislation. But I don't think that that's what you're talking about here. So give me a chance to answer your question. In terms of refuse collection, so this is an example of an area where I'm happy to guide you to the right contacts. But I don't do that in the federal government doesn't do refuse collection. So our best answer to you on that is to refer you to the proper contact at the city and county of Honolulu, because that's who does refuse collection. Um, Ron, could we get a spend plan for the future of rail? We are overbuilding in Hawaii. Also, why was the airport changed? Um, so there is a spend plan in development, another spend plan, I should say, because the spend plan for rail, as we all are painfully aware, has altered on several occasions over the last 10 plus years. Um, there is a recovery plan, which is what it's referred to, is a is a analysis of what it will take to finish rail and to commence operations, and that is the plan that basically says we really can't pull this off if we go all the way to Ala Moana right now. We've got to stop at the Civic Center or somewhere in that vicinity. And so that is, I think, the best resource for you to take a look at in terms of the actual spend plan. I believe that that's publicly available. If not, it should be. It may be that they are revising it one more time to update it, because they do need to have it approved by the feds through the Federal Transit Administration, the FTA, which is contributing to the cost of our rail. And obviously, the FTA wants to know that if they're going to pony up any more money, that it's a plan that can actually work. Why was the airport changed? Um, my recollection in the deep dark history of the rail, and this goes back a long, long time, was that originally there was at least one elected official that didn't believe the rail should stop at the airport, which I thought was pretty stupid. I mean, if you're going to do rail, of course it has to go to the airport. In any event, that decision was reversed, and it does go to the airport. So I hope that answers your question. If not, email me at ed.case@mail.house.gov. All right, Deborah, would you consider having gun owners be required to have their guns license renewed every couple of years? Um, I think it's certainly a very relevant issue. I could certainly envision that in certain situations, gun owners should have some renewal period for their licenses, just as we have renewal periods for driver's licenses. Things change. You want to make sure people still know what the safety protocols are. You want to make sure that they still are do not have um, you know um, histories that indicate the potential of violence with guns. And so I would have no personal issue with that. Now we have generally, of course, these gun laws are generally uh, written and administered by the states, which all have different gun laws. So I don't have any problem considering that. I think it's a good idea. And by the way, I don't know, as we sit here, you might know better than me, and certainly some people on this call know a lot better than probably both of us, whether there are actual requirements in certain situations for the re-upping of of guns, of gun licenses, I should say. Let's see. I've got one from E. I won't say your last name, but it's. I didn't get a question on that, so I apologize. Okay. This is from Theo. Congressman Case, what are your intentions to solve the problem veterans are experiencing with participation or lack of due to outdated EDU policy? I assume that's education policy in the VRRAP program at UHWO, which is UH West Oahu. Um, I I'm not aware of that issue, Theo. I certainly support those programs. I've certainly spent time at UH West Oahu. especially in their programs targeted to and tailored for, veterans. We want our veterans to take full advantage of their educational rights as veterans. We want our veterans to have all of the tools they need to enter post-service society and contribute fully. And these programs are areas that I focus on all the time. In Washington, I represent one of the highest pro rata percentages of veterans in our entire country. We have many, many veterans here, many more, as a percentage of our overall population than many parts of our country. I also serve on the House Appropriations Committee's subcommittee on military construction and veterans affairs. So I have the entirety of the Veterans Administration funding in a pretty small subcommittee of about, I think it's about 8 or 10 of us. And so we spend a lot of time on veterans issues in my office. We also do a lot of individual casework for our veterans. I just spent time in this August at various veterans facilities and organizations to understand your needs. I just am not familiar with this particular issue. And so if there's a problem, let me know and we'll try to help out on making sure that program is working for our veterans. So again, ed.case@mail.house.gov. William, why is the public allowed to own body armor? I've never thought about that. I don't think I don't know why one would restrict the public from owning body armor. I mean, I see nothing. I honestly, I don't think I see a problem with the public owning body armor. If somebody wants to own and wear body armor, I think it's unfortunate in our society that people might feel that they need to own and wear body armor on a, aside from law enforcement, which I believe unfortunately needs to wear body armor in this world. But I don't. I'm not aware of any law or regulation that prohibits it or that should prohibit it. I guess the only area that could possibly be kind of implicated is that nowadays some of the body armor that we use in our military is pretty sophisticated stuff that might have some classified aspects to it, but I don't know that. So anyway, that's my answer. If you want to follow up with me on that, please contact me. Todd, can you effect change to help get mentally ill or drug dependent homeless off the street voluntarily or not into state hospitals or other facilities? Um, I don't I don't directly run those programs, and neither, for the most part, does the federal government, with the exception of some of the veterans and related programs where they definitely do try to get mentally ill or drug dependent homeless veterans off of our streets. That's an area the federal government is directly focused on, and I fully support. We visited one of those facilities just a few weeks ago. But if it's a non-directly federal uh, person under federal law, that would really be administered more by the state and county governments. Obviously, a lot of our um, community organizations, and my role there is to try to make sure that they have the federal funding that they need to do critical work for all of us, not just for that person that is homeless or drug dependent, but for our entire community. Um, I do help people on an individual basis. I mean, if you call my office and say, hey, I need help with this particular situation, we're going to try to find a way to help you. So that's probably going to take the form of us, referring you to the proper agency, to the proper place in state or county government, or in some cases through the folks that we know in the community and try to help in the community organizations. And so if you're talking about a specific situation, give us a contact at ed.case@mail.house.gov, and we'll try to help you there. Otherwise, it really is primarily handled state and county level. Diane, Is there any tracking methods once federal funds are given? Transparency is transparency and monies spent for the public. There have been some really quite good tracking methods applied for federal funding, especially for COVID-19, where we spent somewhere in the range of $5 to $6 trillion in a very, very short period of time. Here in Hawaii, there was a very, very good effort to track those monies in a transparent way. I believe it's still up on the website online. I can figure out what the link is for you if you want to contact me. Um, I certainly track federal monies in my work because it's not good enough to just fund them. You also have to, once my appropriations committee passes a bill and we get it through Congress, we still have to track it in the federal agencies, into that federal agency, and then back out of that federal agency. And then we have to track it from the federal agency to many times the state and county governments here in Hawaii. And then we have to track it out of the state and county governments so that it gets to the place that it's intended to get to. So it's a very, very long and constant process to follow it all the way through. I try as much as I can to publicize those efforts so that people can see what I'm doing. You might want to, for example, go on my website at case.house.gov. In the press release section, I think it's in the media section, press release. And this year, I sent out a press release describing, itemizing the spending in each of the 12 appropriations bills that we pass every year out of appropriations. So go on there. That's my effort to be transparent. But in terms of tracking it all the way through, I do not personally. I don't have it well enough developed so that I say, well, this particular program got this amount of money in the federal government, and then it went here, and then it went here, and then it went finally to this organization. I track it if I think there's a problem, and I track to make sure that it's generally okay. But at that point, it's really going to be more a matter of tracking what the state and county government are spending the federal monies on. It's probably not a very satisfactory answer, but no, I don't have it to that level. But the information is there if you need to find out. Brett, one of your top 5 concerns from the survey is political division. President Biden spent the bulk of his speech today showing more political division. Do you condone or defend his speech today? Well, I guess first of all, I'm going to admit that I didn't hear his speech and I didn't read his speech yet. I've heard reports of it. Like I said earlier, I was over on Hawaii Island at the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force, and then came back here to get ready for this talk story. I think that much of what President Biden said, that at least that I understand, he said, is accurate. I think that there is a difference between political division, political disagreement, political discourse, the exercise of democracy, which is difficult to start with. We all feel strongly about these issues. 720,000 people in my district all feel differently about, in some way, shape, or form, about some aspect of gun control or women's rights or abortion or any number of very hot issues. Of course, that's difficult. But when it goes over the line, and by the way, I'm not going to excuse extremism and intolerance on either side of the political spectrum. I've got some of that on my side of the political spectrum. So I say this to you objectively. But where I cross the line, and I think President Biden tried to speak to this today, is when when that discourse turns into an attack on the foundations of our government, turns into an attack on our Constitution, turns into an attack on our law enforcement agencies that are trying to do their job, turns into an attack on our election system. That's not okay with me. I think that's over the line, and I think most Americans feel that way. I hope you do too. I think that's what he was trying to convey. I think President Biden understands perfectly well that there are people out there that disagree very, very strongly, very, very deeply with him. and with other members of his party on some of the policies that he has followed. I mean, after all, um, the election was a close election, so obviously a lot of Americans didn't think he was the right choice. But that should be confined to the issues. It should be confined to the democratic discourse that we hope and believe is the hallmark of our country. There should be no room in that on any part of the political spectrum for attacks on the foundations of our country. And I agree with him if that was the point he was trying to make. Kathy, when does the Inflation Reduction Act 30% federal income tax credit take effect, reducing the cost to install a rooftop solar system? I need to confirm that because I don't want to give you the wrong information. I'm pretty sure that particular credit kicks in pretty fast. So it's not something like some of the other provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act don't kick in for 1 year or 2 years because you got to give a little bit of time to set up for that. If you can please email my office, ed.case@mail.house.gov. We'll get you the answer. I assume that that's for your own planning purposes. Arlene, I was at your town hall with Kai Kahele weeks ago regarding Red Hill. I've helped distribute water to neighborhoods that are still being poisoned by the contaminated water as of today. What do you plan to do to raise awareness of the plight of 90,000 people? I I think I've tried to describe my efforts, Arlene, on Red Hill, in terms of number one, closing it. First of all, that's the ultimate solution is to close it. Well, more accurately, to defuel it. We obviously want to close it after it's defueled, but the fact that there is still gas or fossil fuel product in Red Hill and in the pipelines is an obvious concern that we've got to track very carefully. If you were at that town hall, you also saw that Kai and I tried to listen as carefully and closely as we could to the continuing concerns of members of the community as to their own health and their own doubts about whether their water was, safe to drink. And we have followed up directly with the Department of Defense on your concerns from that town hall meeting. Now, I don't think that, if I understand it correctly, I think that the Department of Health and the Board of Water Supply have said that the water is safe to drink. Now, I know that there are doubts about that out there, but I'm not aware of any widespread concern that the water currently is unsafe. And so I completely accept there could be situations where people are particularly impacted from previously or even currently, but I don't think it's 90,000 people. I hope that is right, but we have to take every single precaution. So if you have specific instances that you are concerned about, we need to hear about it because, first of all, I need to know about it. And second, we need to communicate that to the Navy primarily. Jerry, Karen handing wild pigs, cow, etc. Karen handing wild pigs, cow, etc. Okay, I think, Jerry, this is referring to some stuff I've heard lately about the wild pig population increasing and kind of invading neighborhoods around our city, in this case, Honolulu. By the way, I've suffered from this too because I've had wild pigs come into my yard and chew it up. So I share your concerns. I've never had a wild cow come into my yard, but I don't doubt it. So this is Department of Land and Natural Resources. State Department of Land and Natural Resources has some resources where they'll try to set you up with folks that will come out and trap the wild pigs in your community. We will help you with that contact. And again, ed.case@mail.house.gov. Gil, why do some Democrats criticize Biden's student loan forgiveness program? I don't know why some Democrats criticize it. I guess I will, in answering your question, I'll try to be a little objective about the various perspectives on President Biden's action. I think, you know, and again, unfortunately, sometimes these issues kind of get characterized in the extreme, not allowing for a reasonable consensus. That is nobody's perfect solution, but everybody's solution that's good enough. One extreme says forgive all student debt in this country. The other extreme is forgive no student debt in this country. Um, this extreme says, hey, we all got the debt. Why should anybody get off their debt? And many of those folks, and I think justly, say, well, isn't it unfair if I paid off my student loan and then somebody else got theirs forgiven? The other side says nobody should have student loans to start with, and let's just borrow all that money from government. Now, for me, the truth is somewhere in between. And I think President Biden tried to hit some sweet spot, but I suspect that there are Democrats that feel that he didn't hit the sweet spot. So that's the best answer I can give you on that. Uh, uh, Tamara or Tamara, what are you doing on a federal level to address resources for homelessness in our state? There are a great number of federal programs that directly or indirectly are targeted at homelessness. These programs from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. I already talked about the Department of Veterans Affairs for homeless veterans. Many programs out there that try in various ways to help folks that are homeless. One of the best known ones for veterans is HUD VASH, Veterans Assistance with Housing. For non-veterans, or I think it actually applies to veterans also if they're eligible. The HUD Section 8A program, which is the housing voucher program, which tries to help people with that. What I try to do is I try to make sure those programs are working for us here in Hawaii, and I also try to fund them. So that's what I'm doing. And again, more information on that on my website, in my e-newsletters on the appropriations cycle this time around. I talked a lot about homelessness in those news releases. Delwyn, when is the Navy going to stop contaminating our drinking water by shutting it down, closing and removing the fueling system at Red Hill? I think I've spoken to that enough. They're going to do it as soon as we possibly can get them to do it. We need to defuel safely. That is going to take more time than any of us wanted it to take. The Navy owes everybody a plan in 1 week. And we're all going to have a shot at that plan. And once we approve that plan, they're going to start the process of defueling. So that's the wins of it. It's still going to be a while before it's completely defueled and closed. Randy, can you push for more COVID vaccination and testing funds? I have done that. We do believe that COVID vaccinations should be increased, as well as testing funds. We, being the U.S. House of Representatives, we have passed that legislation. This is one of those areas where the other side of the Capitol doesn't agree for whatever reason, and so they've been resistant to funding further vaccinations and testing funds. I don't agree with that, but I am pushing for it because I believe that we all need to be fully vaccinated, and I believe we all need complete access to testing as a way through COVID. That's been very clear from the get-go. I think if we had gotten ourselves there faster, we would have seen far less, damage and death from COVID. But that's water under the bridge at this point. But we can certainly avoid it with others going forward. Tamara, I'm going to pass just because you already had one. So sorry about that. But the answer to your question is that I've supported every single bill to ensure a woman's right to choose that has passed out of the U.S. House or that has not passed out of the U.S. House. That's what I've done about it. Miles, what's the status of your bill to update the Jones Act and exempt Hawaii and other island territories? It's still in Congress. It is introduced. It certainly gets a lot of attention. It is a very difficult uphill battle because many of my colleagues don't agree that we should reform the Jones Act, and especially the people that benefit from the Jones Act. They don't want any changes whatsoever. They're so locked in that they don't want foreign tankers to be able to bring oil from the U.S. Continent to Hawaii that was displaced from Russia because of Ukraine. So it's a tough battle, I think, and I'm going to just stay on it, and I'm going to keep talking about it. I think that there is a lot of value just talking about it. And I'm glad you asked that question. I don't often get a Jones Act question, so I'm glad you're aware of it. I'm going to start going really fast here because I'm down to 10 minutes. Myra, I think I tried to schedule a call meeting to talk about electrical charging stations on Oahu. Most charging stations are too slow, often broken, can't schedule a time, require apps that are user friendly and expensive. Just adding more won't help. I if I don't. We'll go track your request for a meeting, but please, um, you know, I try to meet with everybody I can. If I can't, I ask one of my staff to meet with folks. Um, Particularly true when I'm kind of flying back and forth, and particularly intense in Washington. But you know, the bottom line is, can we get the information and the advice and the guidance and the questions that you have and answer them? So give us another try at ed.case. Probably better to just email us, ed.case@mail.house.gov. I agree with you on electric charging stations. The Inflation Reduction Act and the 367 billion that it invests in climate change have a major investment in electric charging stations. And so I expect that there will be a significant increase in federal money that will incentivize state and county governments and private organizations to create more electric charging stations, because we're putting a lot of you know effort into solving climate change by kind of reducing the size and scale, at least, of fossil fuel use in our transportation. Carmi, is there any way that the government will do something about all the scams that are going on all over the world? I think we are trying very hard to get after scams that we know about. The ones that occur to me are scams against our elderly, um, from all kinds of sources. And there's a lot of federal government resources and attention and publications given to trying to recognize and avoid those. We will be happy to send you some of that information if you would like. Um, Karen, I'm not able to listen to the whole live broadcast. Is there a way to view a recording of the whole talk story later? Yes, there is. If you have access to Facebook, it's available to watch again on Facebook. I think we're also going to post it, if I'm not mistaken, on our website, case.house.gov. Andrew, are you for auditing the Fed? Will you co-sign legislation to audit the Fed? I have not co-signed that legislation. Because I believe that to be direct with you, I think that the legislation, if we're talking about the same legislation, it's less about making sure the Fed does its job and more about erasing the Fed, because the particular author of that legislation doesn't believe that we should have a Federal Reserve, that we should have centralized monetary policy, and I don't agree with that perspective. So I have no problem with any federal agency being audited, but I don't think that's the intent of that legislation. Sanford, what is the status of the bill removing cannabis THC from Schedule 1? This is the bill, the initiative that would eliminate marijuana from Schedule 1, which is a reference to a federal criminal schedule. And essentially, for the drugs that are listed on Schedule 1, there's a whole range of restrictions that kick in, including a restriction against doing business around and or banking around around that particular drug. And of course, throughout our country now, we see many states, including our own, loosening up their restrictions, if not eliminating them, on marijuana. And if that state has decided to allow that to happen, I support it, and I believe they should be able to bank freely. So I support taking it off Schedule 1. There are, again, people over on the U.S. Senate side that have declined to allow that to happen. I think they're wrong, but we're going to just have to keep going on that. We've passed those bills out of the State House. Creighton, how is the WEP law being repealed going? This is the windfall elimination from right, Creighton. Good to see you here, by the way, Creighton. We haven't talked for a while. I'd have to check on the status of that. That's been a long-standing effort, and thus far an unsuccessful one. There are, I support it first of all, but there's a cascade of events that follow from doing it, and it would be very expensive to do. And so I think we just haven't decided whether and how to do it yet. That's the best answer I can give you, kind of off the cuff. Lauren, can you help get funds appropriated for healthcare for the Red Hill victims? We're trying very hard to do that, as a matter of fact, as we speak, Lauren. And so we've already done it to some extent. Some of that $2 billion would be available from that perspective, but I think we have a much greater responsibility here. And by the way, those funds would be coming out of the Department of Defense budget. Karen, not a question. I greatly appreciate the intro comments and discussion of questions you know are the top concerns. Thank you very much. I was just listening to you and deciding to answer them up front. Gail, why are gasoline prices dropping across the mainland but not in Hawaii? There are some very, very Hawaii-specific answers to that question that have to do with the market here in Hawaii. Fundamentally, we have what is pretty close to a monopoly on the production and distribution of gas in Hawaii, and I don't believe that should exist. And so there's not a direct linkage between, raw gas prices on the mainland and down here, because they can charge more and they do. And I don't think that has any relationship to the cost of shipping it down here and refining and distributing it here. That was the subject of state legislation some years ago that I supported, which unfortunately was also repealed. And I think we're paying the price for that now. So I would encourage you to take that back up with the state legislature. I think that's going to be the answer to high gas prices in Hawaii, or at least part of them. I am down to 3 minutes, and I've got some 20 questions here. And so what I'm simply going to do is pick out a few, and then I'm going to have to wrap. If your question did not get answered, I don't think we have your email. So please email me at ed.case@mail.house.gov, and we will do everything we can to get it answered. Catherine, what specific resources is the federal government working to provide toxic exposure specialists? I don't know if are you referring to veterans, because I spoke to the PACT Act that we just passed and was signed into law just about a month ago, which does try to go after toxic exposure for our veterans far more systematically. And I believe it does have authority and direction that we not only, pay for the healthcare consequences of our veterans, but also increase our ability to identify when they have been exposed. Aside from that, we do have other programs that are definitely related to health overall that are utilized to fund healthcare specialists, and I'm pretty sure they include toxic exposure specialists. But if you want me to follow up and get more specific with you, just ed.case.house.gov. That's it. I'm down to 1 minute, and they're going to cut me off literally at 7:30. So I am so appreciative for your time again tonight. I have taken so much from our very, very brief time. Another blackout period is coming up, so it'll be another couple of months until my next outreach talk story after the general election. Any questions or issues or needs, ed.case@mail.house.gov. From my staff and me to you and yours, be safe, be well, mahalo, and aloha.